Hey guys, Greg Alexander. Today I wanted to talk about tidal bass fishing and one of the most overlooked components of tidal bass fishing around the country, and that is saltwater intrusion and how saltwater intrusion affects bass and affects their behavior and affects how you can catch them. And this year in particular, where I live here in the mid-Atlantic, we've had an extremely dry year, and the latest readings at one of the tide stations on one of our rivers had the salinity level about 80% higher than it was this time last year. This time last year it was about 8 parts per million. This year it's 15. Well, what are the levels of salinity that a bass will tolerate before he either dies or moves? The preferred level of salinity in a tidal water estuary is 3 parts per million, or 3%, however you want to say it, per million in the water. That's his preferred, 3 or less, 3 to 0. Anything over 3 and the fish starts to be affected by the salt water. Well, how does salt water affect a bass? Well, salt water literally acts as kind of like a depressant or a drug to a largemouth bass. And depending on the water temperature, the cooler the water, the more salt they can tolerate, because cold water holds more oxygen than warm water. So warmer water and salt water mixed together are a recipe for disaster for bass. And common thought is that a lot of these fish move. They leave and they go up the river towards more freshwater areas. And some of them definitely do that. But ultimately a bass is going to stay where he's being fed. And in most tidal water estuaries that I have fished over the years, the general rule is the farther up the river you go, the more fish you catch, but the smaller they are. The farther downriver you go, the more downriver you go, the less fish you catch, but the bigger they are. Now, I understand you catch big ones up the river and you catch little ones down the river also. But as a general rule, that's seems to remain true for me over the years. But when you get to a certain level of salinity in the water, these bass quit feeding. They just quit feeding. And we'll see it a lot, in these rivers in the summertime where it's hot, they're stressed from the heat, they're stressed from the salt, and the fish you catch are skinny, although there's more active bait than there is at any other time of year, but they're skinny. Because it just, it's like if you're sick to your stomach, you're just not going to feel like eating, all the time. And these bass, they just don't feel like eating all the time, and they pretty much eat when conditions are best. So conditions tend to be best at the lowest part of the tide, obviously, where the most fresh water has came down with the tide. The water clears up and their feeding zone is restricted because there's less water in the system. So you'll usually get, when in these conditions, you'll get a very short feed right at low tide, and then it's over. And then you can literally go the rest of the day and not get a bite, or get 1 or 2 bites. So let's talk about the dynamics of how the salt water acts. This salt water that comes in with the incoming tide and tends to go out with the outgoing tide, obviously the more fresh water you get, the more rain you get each and every year coming into the system from the creeks and tributaries, the more it keeps that salt water from coming in. But when that salt water comes in, it comes in on top. And the reason it comes in on top is because salt water is less dense than fresh water, so it tends to stay on top. Now, there's some mixing in a current river or tidal river, but it generally tends to stay towards the top. So, strategies for salty years in your river system. First strategy is find some fish up the river farther. Try to get away from the salt as much as possible. Or when you do fish down the river, do it at the prime time. Okay, we're going to fish downriver more where the fish normally are, but I'm having a hard time catching them this year. But I'm not going to fish through the tides in these areas anymore because these fish just aren't going to bite. So I'm going to fish that last hour outgoing tide, and then I'm going to get back up the river again. That's a strategy that you can use with that. Another strategy is because the salt water is on top, it invades the shallows. You understand? It invades the shallows. The deeper water tends to be less salty. So the fish obviously aren't going to sit up there in 2 foot of water in 12 parts per million salt when they can swim off the edge and be in 5 or 6 foot of water and be in 8 parts per million salt. You understand? And so the shallow game tends to go away in saltier years down the river. It tends to go away. So you have to fish a little bit deeper. Another strategy that you need to employ on the salty years are you either have to be able to generate a reaction strike or you have to fish extremely slow, because these fish are just not motivated. They're not motivated. This salt has turned them into zombies, basically. And so crankbaits, things like that, heavy, quick falling, flipping objects that, boom, they're in their face and they have to react to it. Then you're getting this reaction strike instead of, necessarily a feeding response that you would get under most, circumstances. Or crankbait bouncing around in their face. And you're going to want to be thinking, where a lot of tidal river fish are usually caught 5 foot or less almost all the time, except for the dead of winter. Now you're probably thinking more of like 5 foot minimum to catch these fish. They're just not going to be up there until, like I said, right at the bottom end of that tide around some creek or ditch that's dumping fresh water out. But a lot of times these creeks or ditches that are down the river farther are also shallower and they completely fill up with salt water. So then the salt water never really even makes it all the way out of the creek where there's a freshwater wash at the back of it. You understand what I'm saying? So that stuff tends to go away. So people would ask, well, why wouldn't all the fish, if they just feel bad and it makes them a zombie, why wouldn't they just leave? Well, when you're sick, you don't want to get up off your couch, right? And go for a jog or go for a walk or go shopping at the mall or go to McDonald's for a hamburger or anything. You don't want to do it. And they're the same way. They don't want to do it. So they'll just kind of hang out a lot of times because it just don't feel good. And also, let's understand that in tidal water estuaries, most of the bait is towards the saltwater line. Most of the bait, because that's where the freshwater fish and the saltwater fish mix. You understand? That's where more of your white perch and yellow perch are. That's where your bunker, your LY, they call them, or menhaden, kind of come up to that point. And then they're mixing with, the bluegill and the shiners and the freshwater fish. They're mixing. So the bulk of the food is going to be down the river more. Now there's still food, up the river for sure. Then you're getting into more crawfish and bluegill up the river. So it's a different type of bait presentation also. When you're down the river more, you're dealing with more hard scale fish, white colorish fish, or yellow perch, and you'd want to match that where up the river you're dealing more with crawfish and bluegill and some shiners. So they don't have to move for eating purposes, you understand, down the river in the salt. They'll just find the primest spot they can find that's kind of off the bank somewhere that they can get, you know, where they're just not going to get blown out by the current, and just go into chill mode and then feed at the prime time. And a lot of times in the summertime, that prime time is going to be at night, you know, when most people aren't fishing on tidal rivers at night. You know, unlike a lot of the lakes in the south, a lot of you guys have, you know, nighttime tournaments in the south. I don't ever remember even hearing of a nighttime tournament here in these tidal rivers around. So I guess we could, but we just never have. So they're gonna feed at night or feed right at this prime time. So if you're a type of fisherman that likes to fish fast, I like to fish fast. I cover a lot of water. This year's been a very challenging year for me because my style of fishing quickly, fast, covering water isn't conducive to the mood of the fish. And I usually count on fishing spot, a lot of different spots, 50 spots a day sometimes in a tournament. And it seems like the guys who are doing better this year are really planted in an area and really fishing like super slow. And, you know, next year it probably won't be that way, you know, because every year is different. This year's been extreme as far as saltwater intrusion goes. But every year is not going to be like that. So next year, if it's salty again next year, I have to make a concerted effort to slow down, fish a couple spots, fish them extremely thoroughly with either slow baits or reaction type baits, or get up the river farther than I would normally fish in the summertime. So these are things that you need to consider if you're a tidal water bass fisherman. This is important stuff as far as being able to understand how to catch fish, because understanding is key to maintaining your ability to catch fish in all situations and circumstances, right? Conditions change, and this is just another one of the conditions that you have to understand as a tidal water bass fisherman. So again, if you like my channel and want to watch me on a regular basis, please hit the subscribe button. Please share it with your friends to help me grow the channel. And hit the little like button so you get your alerts when a new video comes up. Again, I thank you for watching. Happy holidays and have a blessed day.